Welcome to this episode of What is Life? I think you'll find it's a little bit different to the other episodes. You may have seen a previous conversation I had with Daniel Schmachtenberger. I hope I've pronounced that wonderful name correctly. In which Daniel mentioned a number of times the work of Forrest Landry and offered to connect me with Forrest, which he very kindly did. Turned out I'd actually met Forrest. I'd forgotten. Met him briefly when I was in America to give my talk at TEDx Berkeley. So we were reconnecting, although we hardly spoke much when we did meet. This time we had the chance to really talk. So it's unlike other episodes in that my intention coming into this was very much to ask Forrest to explain his metaphysical ideas, which I've been wrestling with to try and understand. So settle back, it's a different sort of journey, and see what you make of it.
I'm super glad to meet you. I have all sorts of questions. I've actually been exploring your work since you basically gave me your website link, and I'm still exploring. I'm hoping that at some point you'll maybe I could get a copy of your book. I haven't quite ordered it yet, but
I'd be delighted to send you one, Forrest.
Great. Well, that would be awesome. So I can just sort of read off some of the questions I've been thinking about in relation to yours, so as to maybe create a kind of context, I guess. Does that sound good, or how do you want to conduct this?
Fantastic. Yes, I was going to do exactly the same for you, but let's do it that way around. That would be wonderful.
Awesome. Well, I really like a lot of stuff you're doing in your work. Like, you're asking some really good questions, like what is the relation between science and spirituality? I think also in terms of other topics like technology and religion. So there's a lot of connection between our work just in that in itself. I mean, that's a beautiful beginning. I think in terms of the relationship between man, machine, and nature, sometimes in connection to this, I love that you are asking how can a deep understanding of the theory of evolution help us to understand the human condition. This is like really deep reflection, and I'm just thrilled to see how that can give us insights into our own psyche, into our biases, help us solve world-class problems that are particularly chronic and complex, that are social and things like that. Why are more people altruistic than in previous centuries, and how can we help people to care for others in distant places and animals and things like that? So this connects to a lot of things I'm thinking about in terms of scales of altruism and how that informs good choices with science and technology in particular, since that's such a defining feature. Another question that you think on clearly, how do we encourage more people to make this altruistic transition, to go from self-realization to world realization to, world actualization? These, again, connected to deep perennial themes, and I'm like super thrilled and supportive of that. How can we move our Western culture from celebrating tribal, jealous gods, narcissistic leadership and such to more likely embrace actually enabling peace, to loving leadership, to narrative forms? I mean, these are the kinds of directions. I actually have like a whole list of these. Do you want me to keep going?
Wonderful, wonderful. And so, all right. So you named them so beautifully.
Well, I'm actually. I've got a few more. I'd love to keep going if you wish.
Yeah, keep going.
Okay. How can we all mutually assist a more balanced altruism, operating in a way to feel our connections, the real sense of unity in the universe, in a natural and ongoing way? I especially liked your notion of unividuality and the concept of the deep awake state. This is like really cool. And again, I'm just celebrating that you're clearly bringing that to the world, and that's intensely. I think it's meaningful and important. You ask, what are the means by which we can enable individual people to awaken to this unity, to see the value of the global commons, to experience, how they make choices in a more consistent connection to this oneness with this beautiful universe, and just knowing that life is good, that it's intensely beautiful and meaningful. what's the best way to help people explore questions like, what is the meaning of life? You note that you noted as contributing to soul formation. That's a term I'm still learning a little more what you mean by that, but I at least see it as helping people discover their true basis of choice as part of the process of enabling all beings in this world to find themselves in a more gentle harmony. It's in support of individual and global fulfillment. In other words, you connect those two things, like the notion of the individual is actually, I think that's just a great notion. I liked your notions of complementary conjugate perspectives that, we can, like you named this notion of the paralogical. You go into the both and, you explore thinking as the basis of imagination, or feeling as the basis of imagination, how that can solve problems. And again, maybe I'm reading into your work in ways that are, again, I'm reading it with my own perspective. And so I just see that there's a lot of stuff that you're doing that also fulfills some of my hopes and dreams. I celebrate your deeper connection to and reconsideration of the relationship between personal spiritual values, the notions of collective and connecting that to the notions of religious values, perennial spiritual philosophies, and how we think about these in connection to technology. The way in which social process has gone so, like the way Facebook and Twitter and Amazon and all of these companies, how they basically are influencing our world in powerful ways, and that we need to understand some of these deeper philosophies so that we can balance out the effects of that, how we can think about Western governance in a more general way. And again, these are some of the ways in which I'm trying to show that there's a connection between what you're doing and at least some of the things I'm reflecting on. You're correct to point out that some of the misplaced separations have caused real problems. And that there's global depression, anxiety, and narcissism, and just nihilism, just flat out, like the notion that life is meaningless is just, it's a mistake. It's just misunderstanding the reality of the world. Another thing, I especially love to see your June 16 video where you courageously remarked as to your own personal explorations, and that opens the door for some of these conversations. I don't think I could be here today unless you had come to those understandings and met with Daniel, and he basically, he conveyed so much of what I'm thinking in such excellence, with such clarity and insight, so as to further, increase these perspectives. I mean, it's opened the door for this conversation. So these are some of the things that I think are part of the picture. And I could go on. Actually, there's a part where you're showing what your sort of educational perspective is, and there's some places where it feels a little woo to me. But I think that again, coming from my perspective, there's a way in which I feel like I can support an understanding of that, maybe there's. I think, like I said, the thing that really feels like it's opened the door for you and me is again just the courageousness of that willingness on your part to say, wow, I've written all this stuff and I've done all these things and I've realized that I've made some assumptions, and it's actually really tricky, right? The points that you've noticed, that there's a kind of assumption behind idealism as a philosophy that is just as pernicious as the concepts behind realism as a philosophy, and that neither one of them get us to really deep examination of what you're recognizing as the perennial philosophy. And so, it's actually a little ironic in a way, because this also has been my observation, but it's been an observation that I experienced some 30 years ago. So a lot of my work has been, all of the things that have come from a really deep exploration of that. And unfortunately, again, because of the subtlety of some of these issues, you've experienced firsthand just how nuanced these things can be, and how difficult it would be, and how unlikely it would be for someone to come back and reconsider as you actually have. and then to do so publicly, and then to basically say, I'm human too, and I'm connected to the universe. I'm connected to the totality of the subjective and the objective, and that I'm really trying to come into a balanced conception that includes both of these. And that's gorgeous. I mean, I'm super thrilled to be having this conversation with you.
So Forrest, I'm humbled because I mean it's just beautiful. I mean I just feel like wow, you really have taken in a huge amount of what I do. It'd be lovely if we have time to return to some of the woo things and see where I stand on them and what they are and the idea of soul formation, what that really means. But before we do any more of that on what I've been exploring, I would love it if you could now do the same thing from what you've been exploring and where you think that, where your interest and passion and insight has taken you, that you can pick up on those themes.
Well, that's a vast topic.
I do understand that, but just
I'm truly not kidding.
An introduction to.
Yeah. So my work sort of I really felt the connection between, I guess, sort of this inner perspective, like this sort of nuanced, intuitive perspective, and I grew up as a woodworker. I grew up, as an apprentice to my dad, and I learned a kind of mastery of craft, right? To work with one's hands and to make things, and so science and technology was literally part of my day-to-day experience, and at the same time I had this deep and abiding interest in what now might be called somewhat more woo or religious or spiritual topics. In any case, I really felt that there was a connection between these. Like I wanted to be able to understand the inside world of my own psyche with the same level of clarity and detail and precision as which I could understand mathematics or computer science or any of these areas of physics. So I studied deeply many areas of physics, and I studied deeply many areas of spirituality and religious perspectives and philosophy. And so, in effect, my work has been really an inquiry into the nature of the relationship between the deep subjective and the deep objective.
Right.
And so, in that sense, I looked at it very much as being about that relationship. And Daniel commented on my work. I mean, in fact, a lot of what he was talking about are insights that have come from this. And he and I have been in conversation for a number of years now, and he's really taken on and embodied a lot of these things, so much that it's become part of his unconscious just recognition of the world. And so, like I said, he rendered that beautifully, and a lot of people are now celebrating these concepts and these insights, which is a wonderful thing, and I'm really glad to see that. So, in effect, when we're looking at what is it that I've explored, it's the relationship between the subjective and the objective and the intrinsic nature of that relationship. So that's like the core of the work.
So would you be able to take me through, in your words, the things that Daniel was exploring in my conversation with him
there's several things. I mean, there's a lot. So for instance, he mentioned something, and again, these are very technical things. So for instance, he talked about the Incommensuration Theorem, which talks about the relationship between physics, two bodies of physics knowledge, so quantum mechanics and general relativity. They're very deep understandings of the world and well-validated theories. And so, what is the way in which we understand the relationship between these theories? So I've explored that. What is the relationship between physics and mathematics? That comes out in things like there's a deep proof that mathematics can't be both complete and consistent. So this is part of that connection. There's this thing called the Bell Theorem, which talks about how do we understand the nature of reality at all? What are the limits of our knowledge? So he went into that as kind of like the area where he cited my work explicitly. But the other areas that I think that are important are again, about the relationship between the subjective and the objective, and that we can't have either a realist perspective or an idealist perspective and really get to understanding that relationship well.
Go for that. That's the area I'd most like to focus on. Is what you're exploring there.
So this is somewhat abstract, but the idea is that there's kind of three modalities of perception, or there's three kinds of ways in which we can conceive of the concept of perception. And it's not just perception, it's also, like I said, interaction or expression. So when we're making a choice, it's like a movement from the subjective towards the objective. Or when we're looking at perception, it's a movement from the objective towards the subjective. So we're really considering the movement. And so, he mentioned the concepts of perceiver, which is the subjective, perceived, which is the objective, and perceiving, which is this movement. It's the action, it's the process, it's the dynamic. So in effect, a lot of what I'm focusing on and exploring is the nature of that dynamic, the nature of that movement, the intrinsics of that. So for example, we can make the observation that the relationship perceiver, perceived, and perceiving taken together are distinct concepts, that they are each unique, that the subjective is not the objective, and that neither one of these is the relationship. The relationship is something else. It's something more than that. Mm-hmm. And so in effect, we can make observations that there are these sort of triples that form. The relationship between perceiver, perceived, and perceiving is taken together as a unity, even though we can understand these things individually. So Daniel connected this, I think, rightly to concepts that have been part of the perennial tradition for a really long time, like the Hindu mysticism and the ways in which some philosophers have really embodied this. Wasn't mentioned, but I think is also important is Charles Sanders Peirce, who's done work in this space as well.
I laugh just because I've just spent the last 3 days completely immersed in Charles Sanders Peirce.
Oh, he did an enormous amount of work. In fact, he has his work spans a huge number of disciplines.
Isn't he extraordinary?
Extraordinary man, yeah,
Isn't
just
he?
absolutely
Really?
extraordinary.
Isn't he?
He created I think there's something like 100,000 pages of his essays and works, only a tiny fraction of which has been published.
Oh my God, I didn't know that.
Zach introduced me to him. Zach Stein has been a close collaborator and friend, and has really helped me with this project called Ephemeral Group Process. And I found that, as I explored Peirce's work, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
I know. I'm the same. I look at it also. I want to say Pierce, but of course it is pronounced.
Everyone tells me I'm doing it wrong, right? So
why has it got to be? Why? But anyway, yes, I have exactly the same issue.
Well, nonetheless, he did, like I said, contributed to a number of fields, but in particular, he explored the notion of the relationship between the subjective and the objective, and he did it in the sense of what I think of as Axiom 1. That the relationship is more fundamental than the things related. And this is, on one hand, an obvious concept, but another one, a very counterintuitive one.
Okay, so let me just get that clear. So the relationship is more fundamental than the things related.
That's correct.
I really like that. Okay.
Yeah. Well, this is what Daniel was getting at. So he was attempting to convey the sort of meaningfulness of this.
Okay, let me just stop a second. If you don't mind, I'll just jump in and just ask you to clarify something. What do you mean? I mean, I'm not being funny here, but when you say it's more fundamental, mm-hmm. what does that word mean in that context?
That's a great question. It's not easy to put into language. So there's okay. I need to back up a little bit. So there's theory and there's practice, right?
Yep.
And from the theory perspective, theory and practice are the same. And from the practice perspective, theory and practice are different.
Yeah. Okay.
So Axiom 1 is about theory, right? And so in effect, it's going to conceive of the world in terms of theory. And theory, like particularly in mathematics, has a sort of narrative progression. Mm-hmm. And so in effect, you have think of the axioms of geometry, for example. So there's these 5 sort of postulates, and then from those you can derive all of these wonderful relationships involving triangles and so on.
Yeah.
And in effect, the postulates are taken as being more fundamental than the theorems that are created out of that sort of use of those tools, the tools being the compass and the straight edge. And so in effect, I'm using the word more fundamental in the same sort of way. I'm basically saying that the concept of relationship is more basic as a concept than any conceptual notion of thingness.
So does this relate, so something which is very central to the way that I'm now seeing things.
Yes, correct. That's why I'm saying this is an awesome to connect with you.
Would be that the phrase that I have at the moment, which works for me, is a movement from it's all one to it's the one in relationship with itself, and it's the relationship which is reality, or which is everything?
Yes. I mean, again, I've had a lot more time to explore this, so I've come to some nuanced perspectives. So my
Okay.
perspective may seem like I'm being pedantic, or that
No,
there's a
no. I'm
technicality
happy for you
or
to
so
be
on.
pedantic. That's just precision, Forrest. I like.
Well, the precision sort of would encourage us to think that even in the notion of this oneness, there is a triple, right? So, for instance, we have a
Yes.
domain, we have a container,
Yeah.
and we have this notion of things like elements or objects in that container, and then they have relationships with one another. And so I'm basically saying that the notion of container, the notion of thingness, and the notion of relationship themselves are those concepts are distinct, inseparable, and interchangeable, and they form a whole, right? That the notion of universe can't be conceived of separately from the notion of like this there's stuff and there's relationships between stuff. So we have the notion of unit, the notion of wholeness. We have the notion of the relationship between the units composing the wholeness.
Yep.
And even the relationship between the units and the wholeness themselves as a more abstract concept.
But you're saying the relationship is more fundamental than the things that are relating.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm saying that at a theoretical level. I'm saying that it's
and
inherent in the
I
nature
completely get that.
of thinking itself. Like it's like that we cannot even engage in the action of thinking, of a conception in any way possible at all, that the process itself is a relationship, is expressive of relationships.
Yeah.
So in doing that, it goes beyond just, hey, these are concepts and we're noticing the nature of the relationship between concepts. But insofar as the process of thinking is a process,
Yep.
it is expressive of an ontology. So in other words, that the nature of fundamental isn't fundamental just in theory, it's actually fundamental also in practice.
Okay.
So in a sense, the Axiom One now extends beyond itself. And again, these are very tricky concepts. They're not easy to understand, but essentially, when we go back to Descartes, for example, and he said something like, I think, therefore I am, right? You can kind of look at that and you can say, okay, well, thinking as a process is the basis for being as a process. So in that sense, he's regarding that there's an inherent connection between thinking and being, that these two processes are intrinsically the same process, that the notion of process encompasses both of them. And so in effect, the thinking as a sort of theoretical construct becomes directly entangled with process of being as an embodied one. And that I can no longer regard those as separate. I have to think about the relationship between them as a kind of identity relationship.
Okay, I'm not sure I've got that, and I'm not sure I see Descartes in that way. But let's not get bogged down in that. I want to keep with you. I'll leave Descartes for another time. We can argue about what Descartes meant, but I really want to keep with you. So, okay, so I've got this idea that there's the triplet, the seer, the seen, and the seeing, all of that. I definitely see the resonance with that, with the perennial traditions,
yes,
and all that's been written there. And I see that you're saying, look, it's the relationship which is fundamental, and I really resonate with that. Okay, take me from there.
So in this sort of way, so at this point, we've now observed that there's this association between these concepts, and that became sort of embodied in the notion of what I call Axiom 3, that these concepts, although they are distinct concepts, they are inseparable, right? That I can't really conceive of relationship as a thing unto itself.
Do we have Axiom 2, or do we not need that?
We haven't gotten there yet.
Okay, right, fine. Okay, that's fine. I just want to make sure I hadn't missed it. Okay.
Well, that one's the most subtle, and so I'm kind of trying to build up to it a little bit.
Okay, all right.
Well, I've actually passed through it once, although it hasn't been noticed yet.
Okay, all right.
This is one of those things. It's like these are very delicate, but at the same time exquisitely strong concepts. So when we look at the notion that these concepts are distinct, but they are also inseparable, and they have their own nature. They have their own distinctness, inseparable, and they're not interchangeable. So I can't just replace one with another. So I can't use the concept of thingness in place of the concept of relationship. And I can't use the concept of totality in place of the concept of thingness or of relationship, that they each have their own deep nature, and that their nature is something which is intrinsic in a way that goes beyond conceptual understanding. And so that's one sort of observation, right? We're noticing this, right? And then we go into this Axiom 1 relationship, where we're starting to notice that one of these concepts, the notion of relationship, is inherently deeper, is inherently more fundamental than the things that it's relating, right? That the notion of content and context, for example, that the relationship between content and context is neither an element of the content nor directly isomorphic, i.e. the same as the notion of context.
Mm-hmm.
I can't include the notion of the relationship between content and context as either being content or context. In other words, it has to be three, right? And that relationship is the very basis by which we even know what content and context means as concepts. That the relationship between the zero and the one, truth and falsity, are that the relationship concept is neither the concept of truth nor the concept of falsity. So in effect, the notion of relationship transforms, but also transcends the notion of truth and falsity.
Woo. Okay. Yeah, interesting.
Right. So
Yeah.
so
Carry on.
we're describing truly primal things. I mean, just like exquisitely primal things. So in effect, what we're saying here is okay, we're going to observe this in this notion of Axiom One. We're going to see that there is a depth to the notion of relationship, the notion of interaction, a notion of communication or of connection, or of all of these things that in science would show up as things like measurement and observation. The notion of signaling itself, or even deeper, comparison. That these are all essentially analogs of one another. That there's this thing in the book, it's called the root tautology, right? That there's essentially a deep sameness of the notion of relationship as it shows up in all of these different ways, and that by understanding that,
okay, so I want to just make sure I've got this right. So what you're doing here is you're homing in on what is the commonality in all relationships. Is that
yes,
what you're doing?
That's right, because that's the nature of it, right?
Mm.
And so we observe this in this phenomenon called Axiom One, right? Which, again, I'll get into the abstractions maybe later. But the point is that we're now starting to make observations about the nature of relationship. It's not only got this sort of threeness nature and that these three qualities emerge in it, but also that it's very fundamental, it's very primal, almost beyond our capacity to even conceive of what the notion of primacy even means. So, and that becomes, again, an observation, right? We now call that something, and I call it Axiom One. And again, on one hand, like I said, people can treat this as on one hand blindingly obvious, but on the other hand deeply counterintuitive, because it's effectively saying that, say, like I have a table and I have a salt shaker and a pepper shaker on the table. I'm basically saying that the relationship between the salt shaker and the pepper shaker is more basic than the being of the salt shaker and the pepper shaker. And at a common sense level, that's just ridiculous. I mean, the salt shaker and the pepper shaker are independent of one another. They're independent objects. If I take one away, the other's still there, and so on. But at a level of, say, particle physics, or I hate to say quantum mechanics in context because that takes us directly back to woo. But the point is that we end up with this notion that I can't know that something is there unless I have at least the potentiality of interacting with it.
Yeah. I mean,
so in effect, the very notion of existence itself is grounded in this relational, interactive, observation, objectivity paradigm.
Yeah.
And again, that's a subtle point. I think Daniel alluded to it in the video, that the notion of to be real, to exist, and to be objective are actually themselves concepts in these kinds of things. They are distinct, inseparable, non-interchangeable concepts. They make distinct claims. To say that something is real is to actually make a different philosophical claim than to say that something exists, or to say that it is objective. And so you could kind of think of my work as being like a really deep examination of these concepts, like really looking at, how do these concepts form and how do they have relationship to one another, and what is it that this teaches us about ourselves and about the universe.
And so two things are coming up for me. One is I'm really intrigued by this idea of the commonality in relationship, and also when you've said what this can show us, to really grasp the import of it. Like what is it you're trying to find?
Yeah, you've noticed some of these things. So for instance, like I saw in one of your again, I'm just looking at outlines because that's all
Sure.
that was on the website. But at one point, you basically talk about the reality of time, right? And so one of the things that has come out of this work is the sort of just, again, the general observation that there are really 6 kind of metrics. There's, pattern, and we talk about that in terms of this concept called mass. There's space, which is kind of the container in which we understand what pattern is. It's like the holding of that notion. There's time and force, right? How much we can push on one another. The notion of interactiveness itself involves a flow, a kind of exchange of energy or an exchange of
Yeah.
pressure, so to speak. So there's time and there's force. And then finally, there's possibility and probability, or probability in possibility. So in other words, possibility is what can happen. If I'm tossing a dice, there's 6 sides that it'll land on. Or if it's a coin, there's 2 sides. Accepting a few exotic things like maybe it lands on edge. But the idea is that there's only so many possible things that will happen. And then we can assess what is the probability of any one of those things occurring. And so you can think about, say, quantum mechanics as basically being an observation about the relationship between probability over possibility and time and force. And that shows up in this deep notion of what is the Planck constant. And then we can look at general relativity, and we can see that the relationship between pattern and space, matter and gravitation, is effectively a relationship between, matter and space and forces in time, right? What we think of as gravitation is a force, and the way in which time is wrapped up into space is part of the nature of how general relativity works. So, again, I'm getting into tangents here, and I should come back. But the idea here is that, this notion of relationship.
Go on, carry on first. I'm doing my best here to keep exactly with you, because you're covering a lot of ground, but it's very interesting ground, and just let it flow.
You've been exploring, how does science and technology, connect to spirituality. So I'm trying to sort of set up some tools for you to see that. And so in one sense, we're talking about, the notion of signaling as being the inherent nature. Like if you study general relativity deeply, it's about things like causation and signaling. And if you study
causation and signaling, can you just gloss what you mean by signaling in that sentence?
Well, the speed of light is effectively a description that you can only propagate information through space and time at a particular rate.
At speed, yeah.
So in other words, the C constant, the speed of light constant, is fundamentally a relationship between, guess what? These 3 ideas.
Yes.
Space, time, and this notion of signaling. How fast does information propagate?
Okay, so that's what you mean by signaling. Okay, right.
Yeah,
gotcha.
Because the speed of light isn't so much about light. It's actually about how fast can information
causation,
move through
isn't
space.
Isn't it the speed of causation, essentially?
Effectively, yes. Causation as seen from an outside point of view. I mean, when you go to quantum mechanics, you start to see things like entanglement. And the relationship between causation and entanglement is a deeply subtle one. It has to do with things like the Bell Theorem and the free will theorem, which is actually quite important because it connects back to this notion of the Incommensuration Theorem I was mentioning earlier. So in effect, when we're looking at, how does physics, again, in terms of these 6 concepts, right? So the notion of time and force ends up being more basic than our way to conceive of both matter and space through the vehicle of general relativity, and also more basic than the vehicle of quantum mechanics to understand changes in probability and possibility, right? So in other words, you can think of the Schrodinger equation as kind of describing an evolution of the potentiality of state. And so that's a sort of description of the inner nature of the motion of subjectivity.
Say that again.
That process is essentially a description of the inner nature of the motion of subjectivity.
Say that again in a different way. I want to get what you just said then, because I don't think I've got that.
I'm basically saying that, the way in which we think about choice, and the way in which we think about randomness, and the way in which we think about the nature of the arrow of time, right? That there is a here and now, that there's a present moment that is somehow distinct from all other moments, at least in terms of our firsthand experience of it. The notion that there is a here, to our consciousness is indelibly connected with the notion of what I would call hard randomness, as it shows up in things like physics and quantum mechanics. This is referring to a lot of different stuff, but also that it's connected to, again, the notion of the subjective as self, as consciousness, the notion of time, and the notion of randomness, as shows up in quantum mechanics, are inseparable. They are indelibly connected concepts, and that the nature of
Time,
quantum mechanics,
randomness,
and the
and subjective.
Yeah. Are intrinsically deeply connected concepts, and that we can actually treat quantum mechanics. I mean, again, there's a lot of people who have taken this into the woo direction, but there is actually something there. There's a reason why so many people have had an intuition about this. There is a genuineness to the notion that there is something philosophically important about that.
Yeah.
And so in effect, yeah.
So go on, finish.
Well, I guess you could say that in a large respect, again, you were asking about, what is the things that I've been exploring?
Yeah.
Part of my exploration is effectively to really understand the relationships between these theories and how they inform ourselves in terms of things like evolutionary process or social process or cultural dynamics that effectively have an impact on our ecosystem. So in effect, there's a deep connection between, as I'm saying, the notion of time, which you've observed, and the notion of being real, the notion of knowing that there is realness.
So where I find myself resonating with what I understand of what you're saying is that, and an idea which is very fundamental on the stuff I'm working right now is the idea that a thought which occurred to me, which was a clarification of something I've been exploring for a long time. I just did a lecture for the Science and Medical Network, and afterwards it occurred to me what I wanted to say, really, and I hadn't said it in the lecture, was that science had already given us the concepts that we can bring science and spirituality together, and the four that came to mind was evolution, emergence, information, and relationality. And that what you're touching on a lot here is that relationality, and I see that in time as relational, space as relational, energy
well,
as
actually,
relational.
it's all four of those. So in effect, I think that there's a certain way in which you're on the right track, but in effect, you can kind of see my work as being underneath that. So in other words, to me, those four things are essentially epiphenomena of an even deeper construct that actually infuses and informs those with meaningfulness.
Okay.
So metaphysics ultimately is, as I said, a kind of exploration of the relationship between the subjective and the objective, between one's personal self as an embodied being and the universe that we find ourselves in as a reality, as a creation. And that, in effect, what we're looking at is how do these deep concepts provide a rich source of meaningfulness, a way in which that the things that we assume as concepts, like, for instance, you take the scientific method. You have a hypothesis, you make some observations, and you compare the observations with the hypothesis. I mean, vaguely stated and kind of broadly, people can get into the particulars of that. But the idea here is that somewhere there's a connection between self and reality in that process. There's a connection between, how I am internally and how the world is externally. And I'm going through this observational process. We can call it an epistemic process. How do I know something? What does it mean to know anything at all? This is part of the reason why it's connected to metaphysics in the first place, because those are the two great questions. What is, and how do we know?
Okay, this is a great opportunity. Okay, so, and your response to those two questions in essence is what?
My response to that, so for instance, those two questions, they have names. So the first one, what is called the question of ontology. And the second one, how do we know, is called the question of epistemology.
Epistemology,
right? So these things. So in my work, what I've basically done is I've basically have shown that there's a way to understand both of these questions and those concepts themselves in a kind of larger and more inclusive dynamic that is even deeper than that.
Okay, so take me there.
Well, that's what the axioms and the modalities are.
What is it to do that? So, say again?
Well, that's what the axioms and the modalities are.
Okay, so use those axioms, and I'm not so clear on the modalities, but to take one of those. So let's take what exists. let's take ontology. What's your response? You know, I have a narrative which I can.
Well, first I would go from what exists to the notion of nosing that we need to interact with something to establish that exists, and that interaction and relationship is therefore the thing we're actually asking about.
Okay.
Interaction and relationship is real.
Yes.
The choice, change, and causation are real. And that's a triple, right? The notion of choice, change, and causation.
How did you get to those three?
Well, I just went directly there because you were asking me to skip ahead.
Okay,
so,
bless you. All right, but I'm going from the question of ontology, and then you've gone, that must be a relationship. I'm completely with you there.
Right. And I'm
what
saying
does
that
that
we can
say about
understand
what
that
exists?
relationship in terms of these triples.
Yeah, okay. So then what's your answer to what exists? Like, you know, this series of, you know, what is life? What is existence? What is your, as a philosopher, what's your response to that?
There's beingness.
Yeah.
Right. And then from that emerges existence and creation.
Okay. And what does existence mean for you, and what does creation mean for you?
Well, okay, you okay. Let me back up just a second because I want to.
Okay.
This is easy. It's really easy, but it's like we want to come in from the right direction so that it's felt as easy.
Okay.
So in a sense, like one of the great philosophers, Douglas Adams, he wrote these wonderful books.
One of my great heroes.
Yeah, I know, I love him. Anyways, one of his observations was to say, you know, to actually ask that question that you're asking, right? What is the life, the universe, everything? What does this all mean? You know, and then he has this sort of joke, you know, 42, right? And then they spend the rest of the time sort of trying to come up with the notion of what the hell was the question, right?
Yeah.
So in this sense, I guess you could say that I'm focusing on the nature of the question.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm asking, you know, when you ask what exists, the first thing I do is I say, well, let's consider the nature of the question. What are we really asking? Well, we're really asking, what is the nature of relationship? And what is the nature of the connection between the notion of real and the notion of relationship? I'm basically saying that notion is one of identity, that there is no realness that is not a relationship, and there's no relationship that is not real.
There's but to claim no that is to make a which different is not a relationship, and there's no relationship which is not real.
Right. But to make that is a different claim than to say that something exists. If I move it into the realm of existence, then I now have to include another concept implicitly of this sort of container with which respect to the notion of existence can be defined. If I'm talking about relationship, I don't have to specify the container in which that relationship happens. It's implied already in the notion of relationship. But if I move to the notion of existence, then I need to, in a sense, include the notion of container explicitly. And we notice this when we think about, say, the universe as a totality. Like most of the time in philosophy, there is this idea that universe is a container in which there's a bunch of stuff, galaxies and planets and stars and all that sort of thing. And when we basically use that kind of notion, we're basically saying there's this stuff and it interacts with one another, and somehow all of this came into being in this thing called the Big Bang, which is the moment of creation, and this stuff has just more or less been banging into one another ever since. And I'm basically saying, well, that's one way to think about it. But if we step back just a little bit and we think about what is the notion of universe as a concept? Well, really, it's a composition. It's a composition of three other concepts: the notion of creation, the notion of existence, and the notion of interaction. And then
why does it have to involve the notion of creation?
Well, because to consider the universe, I need to consider all three of those things. So if I don't actually understand anything about how it came to be, I don't understand all that needs to be known about this notion of universe.
Maybe it didn't come to be.
Well, how did it all get here then? I mean, that could be asked a question. If we're going to take time as fundamental, then I have to.
Well, personally, I do think this universe came to be, but I don't see it as inherently. I don't see that theory as inherently in the concept, because.
Well, I'm not advocating for the concept of the Big Bang.
Lots of people have, you know, through history have believed we live in an eternal universe, and that.
Agreed. So that's why I was saying it isn't necessary for me in this moment to advocate for a particular perspective.
Yeah.
Of how we came to being.
So why is creation inherent in the concept of universe?
Because in that particular sense, it connects back to how choice, how emergence, how randomness, or any of these kinds of things, like, for instance, if there's no becoming, then the question can be asked, well, how did you end up isness without becoming? Like if there's a, if we're looking at do, be, and become as a triple, to
Yeah.
understand doing, I need to understand becoming. To understand being, I need to understand doing. And to understand becoming, I need to understand being. And it makes a circle, as a loop.
Take me back to the universe.
Okay.
Because I'm going to get lost. So you were saying, look, to understand, this is where I've got to. There is, I'm going, okay, follow that into one question with your method, and we've chosen the ontological question, and then you've gone, okay, actually, what is that question? Let's find out what the question is. And the question is about a relationship.
Right.
And then you've gone, as an example, let's take the idea of the universe. And then you said it was three concepts, and I've questioned whether one of them is inherent in it. And that's where, can we pick up there?
Okay, so effectively there's an Axiom 3 statement that the notion of existence, interaction, and creation, or more popularly, creation, existence, and interaction. The ordering and the sequence is important, but it doesn't matter right now. It's just that the idea of where did the interacting things come from? If we presume that thingness happens before interactiveness,
Okay. So what you're talking about origin or time, essentially.
Yeah,
not necessarily creation, but the fact that something's come from somewhere else.
Yeah, I'm invoking it passively, right?
Okay.
And I'm doing it passively because ultimately, as you're pointing out, that it isn't really yet about the relationships of dependency between these concepts, so the relationship of fundamentalness between these concepts. We're just asserting at this point a kind of association. When we get to Axiom 1, we can start to look at relationships of dependency or relationships of fundamentalness. And then when we get to Axiom 2, we can start to talk about relationships of cycle or actual process. So in effect, we need to move back and forth between theoretical conceptions and embodied practical first-hand realizations. Like at this moment, you and I are in communication. I'm attempting to convey something that I've experienced so that you get the opportunity to experience that. So in effect, we're using language as a means to convey ideas. But somewhere along that way, there's an emergence. There's a new idea that you notice. It's, in one sense, it's always been there, but in another sense, you discover it. So, for example, we can ask again one of these deep questions: is reality something which we just observe and discover, or is it something that, in the process of observing it, we create?
Mm-hmm.
And this goes all the way back to the notion of realism and idealism.
Okay, so that bit I completely get. That I completely get. That we are not creating it in that woo-woo kind of what the bleep way, but
it isn't. It's also not the case that it was all there and that perception is entirely passive.
No, it's not. I think we are the what's arising is the interaction of the subject and the object always. Exactly. And that goes right the way back through the evolutionary process to the very beginning.
Exactly.
That's always the two meeting.
I would be a little careful about using, and Daniel also pointed this out, and I know he's doing it for similar reasons. The use of the term evolution is also a technical concept. And so, for instance, in one sense, I can definitely support how you're thinking about this, but in another sense, I'm coming at it from a more pedantic position. So I'm going to leave that as a side, but that might be something we might want to bookmark. In effect, to come back to the question that you're asking, which is, how did these concepts show up?
Well, and go for keep relating it back to the basic ontological question, because that's a good one to focus on.
Exactly. Well, that's why I went into the notion of universe.
Yeah. So we're asking what exists, and I've got as far as it's a relationship, and I'm completely with you there. And then I need more.
Well, I'm trying to create an example. So, for instance, if we were to say the universe exists.
Yes.
Okay. So now I'm basically trying to substantiate how do we understand the meaning of the question.
Okay.
And part of that is, again, I'm just developing a kind of conceptual infrastructure. So on one hand, we can look at the universe as being a container that's got stuff in it. And we can say, well, how do we know any of this stuff exists? And then we can ask, well, how did the container come to exist? And what does it mean to say that the container even exists? Okay, that's one line of questioning, and that goes in a particular direction. But that's not the line that I took. Instead, I basically made the observation, well, the concept of universe and the concept of existence, right, of matter, they don't just occur by themselves. That's not enough. I need to think about the concept of interaction, because if I'm thinking about what is real rather than what exists, then I can come to the notion of recognizing that to ask what is real is actually a different question.
Okay,
and
so
we went into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I distinguish what is real from what exists as well, but I may be doing it in a different way. So
And so at this moment, let's just park that and just say that for my own part, I also made that distinction.
Okay.
And whether we made it in the same way or not, we can let that go and come back to that. But the idea is that we can then say, okay, well, if it is about the reality of it, then I'm going to be exploring it in a different way than if I'm exploring it as what is the existence of it. So as a result, there are certain implications. One of them is that I had to also include the concept of creation, that I couldn't think about the notion of universe without thinking about three concepts: creation, existence, and interaction.
You couldn't think about the notion of universe without the idea of, so I'm still, I can see the interaction bit very easily. That's easy for me to see. Creation, are you simply talking about the nature of that one thing comes from another? Is that what you mean by creation? Or do you mean literally the creation of something?
Both.
I don't see that at all. I don't follow that at all. I don't see why.
I can't invoke the concept of either pure process, as in there's no emergence, or the process of creation from nothing, ab nihilo, right? Neither of those are correct, in the same way that neither perfected realism nor perfected idealism are correct. And it's actually for the same sort of reasons.
And what is that reason?
Well, that it's something else. It's something between those two concepts. There's some amount of emergence, but you can't account for the emergence in terms of purely theoretical constructs. And in effect, there's a sense that you can't have creation from nothing, because even then, not only can you not account for it on theoretical constructs, but you can't experience that as a first-person perspective either.
That's definitely true.
Right. So in effect, what we're saying here is that if we're going to say, well, how do we know something, right? How do we know anything about process? Well, one of the things that's been an observation, at this point, I'll treat it as an observation, but it turns out to have some really very strong ways of thinking about it that connect quite powerfully. But the idea here is that at this moment, I mean, we could go further into talking about creation as a concept. I'm just trying to essentially assert that regardless...
where I'm stuck, Forrest, is I've got this idea, you've got the triplicate, and then you've very nicely given me an example, a good example, because we're looking at the universe, which is a pretty good thing to look at if you're talking about ontology. And then you've said it requires these three things. So we've got the relationship, and what was this, and creation. I don't get creation. And what was the third one?
Existence.
Okay. And existence, I think I get that depending on what you mean by the word, but I think that's fair enough. So, but I'm trying to see how these fit together.
We haven't gotten there yet.
Why they fit together, and the whole creation thing is completely. We haven't gotten to that. I'm completely stymied as to why.
That's okay.
We have to talk about creation when we think about the universe necessarily. I realize we might do, but I don't see any necessity in it.
Well, here's the thing. I can really only answer one question at a time.
That's true. That's linear time for you, mate.
But to answer the question that you're asking me now about creation, I have to actually build the infrastructure to be able to address that, and we don't have it yet.
Okay.
Right? So because we're still talking about how do we understand how these concepts show up.
Okay.
So at the moment, I can just basically assert the same sort of way that if I'm going to think about relationship, I can think about things, and I can think about the domain, the container.
Okay.
Right. And we could treat that as the triple if we wanted to. So for instance, instead of talking about the universe, I could talk about domains.
Yeah.
And a domain is sort of like just this, like a subject of study, right? Or, a world of activity like the marketplace.
Yep.
And that in that marketplace, there are things like,
Yep.
dollars and cars and so on, as abstractions that I can have transactions about. And the transactions represent relationships.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. I'm with you. Oh, that's very clear.
Okay. And that if we really want to understand the relationships between these concepts, right? Because like you said, you wanted to explore what is creation, then to some extent, I need to understand how that concept can be understood in terms of these other concepts. So if I want to understand, say, money as a concept, right? There are going to be other things that I need to understand in order to do that. So for instance, well, there may be a digression. Let's stick with the domain concept. The distinct, inseparable, non-interchangeable piece was the first part. Then we can basically say that relationship as a concept is more fundamental than both the things and the container,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we alluded to that earlier.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the Axiom One position. So now we're starting to develop a theory of which concepts are more basic than which other concepts. But then we can start to consider ourselves as considering these concepts. What is the process by which we understand these concepts, or what is the process by which we understand understanding itself, right? What is the epistemic process? Okay, so this is now all of a sudden we're starting to notice that we can't go into the notion of ontology, what is, without also considering the notion of how do we know what is.
Okay. Yep. Yep. I get that completely.
So Axiom 2 is the space that we're now sort of moving into. So we started with Axiom 3.
Yeah.
We transitioned to Axiom 1, and then we're starting to think about process rather than just theory. What is the practice? What is the embodied practice by which we communicate ideas or reach understanding? What is the nature of the communicative process, and what transformations does that create? What is the becoming that emerges out of the communicative process?
Okay.
So in effect, when you're asking me something like, what exists? Now I can start to say things like communication exists, process exists. But I can only really do that by kind of conflating the notion of exists and real. It's actually the case that communication is real, that our conversation in this moment, at least I'm having an experience of something. I mean, I'm looking at a screen. I see, a beautiful man, and I'm hearing your thoughts, and I'm experiencing this as a manifestation of another consciousness. I'm essentially responding as a being to a being.
Yep.
And so in that sense, although I don't necessarily know all of the details of how the computer screen works and so on, although actually as a technologist, I have a pretty good background in a lot of this, but the fact is that there is something happening, and that something has a reality that is intrinsic. It's indelible. I might not necessarily have been able to predict where it came from. Or predict the future. I can't tell you, describe all of the things that have come to be before this being of this moment. And I can't necessarily predict for you all of the things that will come from this conversation. But I can at least say that the here and now is real.
So I think what we've got to, which I really actually quite like, but it's kind of, I love it because it's obviousness. It sounds like you're saying something exists, and that is something. I mean, like that's kind of like a bit like Descartes in a way, but the fact that we're doing this means that there's something.
Well, the axioms and the modalities are essentially an observation of the deep pattern. So in effect, so there's a
So the pattern is I've got the relationship part of the pattern, but for some reason, when you step out from that, I'm not finding I'm left with anything.
Well, there's a lot more architecture and infrastructure. So, unfortunately, it takes time. I mean, the book. So, quite honestly, I never expected that book to be read or recognized by literally anybody in my lifetime. I was thinking it might become relevant to a civilization process a few hundred years from now. I didn't think this world would be ready for it for quite some time. but because of Daniel and some others, it has now all of a sudden started to come into some recognition, and people are starting to ask questions. This is how this conversation came about. And so in a certain sense, I was really thinking that that these abstractions, I mean, for a number of reasons, I presented that book in a context. I mean, it was meant to be presented in a kind of collaborative community context, like that there would be a whole series of conversations very much like this one that emerge over
Right.
time and
Right.
can develop these ideas so that they're relatable. The book itself is a bit, you can think of it as like a handbook that goes with a whole series of teachings. It's meant to be embodied in a culture. And so people are encountering it by itself right now. And of course, it's impossibly difficult because there is, as you just said, there's no easy way to relate to it. Not without this context.
So if we go back to the fundamental question that we've homed in on, that what exists, again, so given the things that you've been exploring, I mean, your response to the question, what exists,
is real.
Is process is real.
Yep.
Yep. Okay.
And that the notion of existence emerges out of process.
Okay. All right. Let's home in on that. Process is real, and the notion of existence. So, because how you're going to have to define real and existence for me, according to how you see those words.
And technically, I should define objectivity too, but because that's also part of the same triple, right? But
yeah. Okay.
Okay. So. Just in a very classic sense. So let's just imagine, for example, or I'm just going to declare, I have an imaginary friend. He's named Fred, and he's tall and he's got red hair and he has, he's holding a pencil. Okay. In what way would anyone else know that Fred exists? Well, they'd have to measure something. They'd have to interact with him, right? So in other words, take a photograph and see Fred, or reach out and touch him if you happen to be in the same room, or maybe he wrote something on a piece of paper and you can show me the paper and say, Fred wrote this. But one way or another, there's an interaction. There's some sort of process that is connected, the process of your being and the process of his being. And that in that connection, we can know that Fred exists.
Okay.
Right? So in this sense, we can pretty much observe that even in physics, for example, things exist to the degree that they're observable, to the degree that they have properties. If they don't have any properties at all, if they're not measurable, if they're not observable, then we go back to the sort of Popperin sense of, well, there's no falsifiability. We can't say that it's true or false, and therefore there's no difference between those concepts in this case. So in a certain sense, the notion of existence, therefore, depends upon the notion of at least having the potential to interact with it.
Okay. Yep. I've got that. All right. So what exists, process exists, and existence arises from process. Is that right? In
a general way, yeah. I mean, that would be, again, a fairly prosaic way of putting it. And again, from my world, people will tell you that, I'm impossible to understand and that, I'm very difficult and so on. But, the thing is that it's actually quite ironic because in a lot of ways, these concepts are truly part of everybody's experience. They're part of the here and now of everybody's lives.
Yep.
And so in one sense, people have an intuition about these things. There's a deep sense in which people already know what I'm telling them. But if we're going to get it to the point where we can hold these concepts with precision and we can really say, with enough clarity.
So are you saying, Forrest, that the answer to the question, what is existence, what is life, what's the life universe and everything, that the answers that you're drawn to is actually a concept? Exists. That's what exists. Is the concept of process. No, I go back to the concept
of real. So in other words, I don't spend.
Do you understand what I'm asking there? Because it sounds to me like you're answering it by pointing to not just concepts about something that exists, but actually the concepts themselves as being the fundamental things.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. At a certain point, I'm basically pointing out that the notion of ontology, what is, and the notion of epistemology, how do we know,
Yeah.
have the same ground.
Yes,
They are, in
definitely.
fact, part of the same pattern.
Definitely, yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so, in effect, if you're asking, a little bit about what the core of my work is, well, the core of my work is literally a description. It's a kind of presentation in the language which we both know as English of that pattern.
Okay. So those are I can see the relationship between those two. Are they part of a triplicate for you as well?
Yes,
Or is that,
they are.
and what's the third one?
Objectivity.
Okay, so it's how does that work? So you've got epistemology, ontology, and objectivity. That seems
Well,
a very different thing.
yeah, so the scientific method, the way I was describing it earlier, related the self and the ground of truth, or the world, right? But there's actually a third piece, which almost never gets mentioned in the literature, which is that at some point or another, scientists talk to one another. And that part of the scientific method is that people repeat the experiment and they come to share their results with one another. And that through this process, the community of scientists begins to believe that it has some knowledge of the world, right? So this
Yeah.
is what we call the body of knowledge that is science. But in effect, the epistemic process isn't just the questions I ask and the experiments I perform. It's to some extent things like peer review and the kinds of
Sure.
processes by which we compare notes, as we are doing right now.
Yeah.
You have, as I've come to know a little bit as I get to know you, been in these explorations for some time, and at this point we're comparing notes.
Yeah.
In effect, we're comparing notes from slightly different positions. I've had a chance and the opportunity to explore certain questions for the majority of my life. And so in a sense, I'm kind of reporting from the field. I'm basically saying, wow, I've had all these experiences, I've learned all this stuff, and now I'm communicating it to community. I'm communicating it to culture. I'm connecting it back to the social.
Yeah.
So that hopefully the culture has a chance to endure, because as Daniel may have alluded to, and certainly has in a number of other of his works, there are some real concerns, and that in a sense, some of this material is now being used to go beyond just spirituality and to think about community process. Like, how do we understand value? How do we understand the relationship between meaning, value, and purpose?
So maybe that's a good direction. Maybe towards this last bit of our conversation, maybe focusing on that for us about how the thing that you're exploring in this more abstract realm then becomes embodied in value and community and in the real world problems that we face as human beings.
Well, this closes the loop, because this is about what objectivity is, right? So for instance, I
Okay.
can make an abstract assertion that something exists.
Yeah.
But then I can sort of now compare notes, and then we can say we're both seeing something that is real.
Yep.
And that the degree to which we believe that it is real is what we mean by there's an object there. There's an objectivity there. It transcends just the subjective.
Yeah.
More
It's
specifically,
intersubjective.
it becomes intersubjective. It transcends my personal subjective and becomes
Yeah.
our collective subjective.
Yeah.
And so in effect, there's a sense here by which when we're thinking about community process, and we're really trying to understand, and again, this is where I think your work about recognizing evolution as being important, is that to a large extent, at least as I've experienced it, that we don't really understand the human condition well, and we need to.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We really deeply need to, and that recognizing ourselves as embodied beings, we need that as a ground, both individually and collectively, to be able to hold some of these concepts, and also to be able to hold, as has been quoted any number of places, is we have at this point divine powers. Right? Technology has, like you
Yeah.
think about, you go back to Greek, for example, and
Yeah.
you have Zeus, right? Zeus could throw lightning bolts, right? I mean, that's just a really big deal. I mean, think about that. It's like awesome, right? But then you have, nuclear weapons, and as a side effect, as an ephemeral, kind of incidental thing, there's like 100 lightning bolts, and like actual electrical lightning bolts. I mean, if you look at closely at photographs of this sort of stuff, and so on, and if you know what you're looking for, you can see genuine discharges, right?
This
isn't a metaphor.
phenomenal example. Comparing that to Zeus is a marvelous example of what's happened.
This is my point, is that to some extent we are dealing with this enormous thing in philosophy called the ethical gap, right? How our capacities in the world you look at the relationship between science, spirituality, and science, and in governance, it shows up as a disconnect between religious thinking as a value system and governance thinking as a kind of community choice making, and that somewhere along the way, our values have to inform our choices. What is our basis of choice? But in the sense that our technology has become so exquisitely strong and so powerful and is now literally damaging the substrate upon which our very lives depend, that it is incredibly important that we be very discerning and very actually wise about the choices we make and the basis from which those choices come. And so in effect, there's a need for us to ground ethics, which is the principles of effective choice, with the same level of clarity and precision and distinctness, the accuracy necessary to make the choices that are needed in the world to be able to hold such awesome powers rightly.
And how do you think we do that?
Well, there's some reflection here. We need to close the ethical gap. We need to actually become divine. We need to, in a sense, recognize that we move beyond a kind of narcissistic nihilism and create much more embodied notions of what, as you to move from, as I think you said at one point, jealous gods to compassionate ones.
That's a really interesting thought, and I've never quite seen it that clearly because of your example of Zeus. The vision I've just had then, which is, like I said, is not one I've had this clearly, was like, oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Because you said we need to become divine. And then if I look at what that concept of what divine has been, then you do end up, you go back and you've got Zeus and you've got a whole mad family of gods.
I mean, this is going to be somewhat heretical to say, but if you apply DSM-5 criteria or now DSM-6 criteria to all of the divinities, most of them come out as paranoid, delusional narcissists. I mean,
exactly.
It's
with too much power.
Well, and the technology's here.
So,
right?
but what's so interesting about that is that you can actually see the concept of the divine coming through. So certainly by the time you reach certain forms of Gnosticism and Christianity and things like that, you get this for the one.
But there are better visions, right?
You get a beneficent, loving,
exactly,
deity. And so, are you saying what the point which is intriguing me here is? Are we at the level of? Is our divinity at the level of the ancient gods right now, and we need to move it up a gear to the agape?
We need to move it up. Yeah, we need to move it up.
So we're divine, but we're divine, but not in the mature way that we need to be divine.
That's correct.
We have power without the love, without the wisdom.
That's right. But fortunately, there are some models, and you've pointed back to perennial things. And Daniel also, I mean, he referred to some concepts of Hindu mysticism. There's a lot of stuff in Buddhism. I'm pointing to Eastern things a little bit here, but it isn't just that, right? There are some Western traditions. They're just not at all well known. And so in effect, there's a sense here at which really, like, for instance, with Christianity, there's a recognition that spiritual process can actually be beneficent, that religions can be beneficent. They have, obviously, there's been all sorts of wars and huge trauma in so many people's lives. And that's a lesser manifestation of what religion can be. And so in effect, what we're needing to become, we're actually as a species forced to get better at. It's either get better at this or we're doomed. I mean, it's really that simple. The point is that in effect, we not only need to be wise, but we need to be wise with precision, with ethical clarity.
So how does your insight that we've been exploring affect that? Okay, sorry.
That's precisely where I was going. So you're anticipating me, which is great.
I was on the right thing at least.
Yeah. So for instance, what I've observed is that, if you look at science and technology, it's really, really good about talking about causality. And for the most part, it tries to wrap up the notion of change into causality. But if we're really going to understand the notion of real, we actually need a ground for the notion of choice. Because if we're thinking about ethics, and we're thinking about ethics as being the principles of good choice, not just individually, but collectively, we need to ground the notion of choice in something that is actual, something that is meaningful. And we need to show that the notion of meaningfulness is actually itself grounded. It's not just about purpose. It's not just about what can we do, but it's about why are we doing it and what does that mean? So in effect, what I've done is I've created a series of concepts, a series of architectures that allow for the emergence of those concepts to be recognized as grounded at a level of truth that is at least as deep as everything we know about science and technology and more. Much more. So there's a kind of almost beyond the perennialness of this. This is touching the very ground of being itself. And so if we can connect our choices back to those, I would call them deep spiritual truths, but even that itself is transcended, then it is for sure the case that we as a species can make wiser choices. That's really, really needed. Really profoundly needed. And so, in effect, the reason that I'm here and why I'm doing all of the stuff that I do and all of the trials of that is that I know that that matters. I cannot not know that that matters. And so, in effect, what I'm essentially attempting to do is to provide the capacities, the conceptual infrastructure that would allow for not just the maturity, but the wisdom. And that wisdom to be held at a level of depth that is commensurate with the powers and the capacities that science and technology have given us. Because they can sure as hell tell us a whole lot about what we can do, but they don't tell us anything about why we should do it. And so, in effect, we desperately need to have clarity about the why and the what and the how. Yeah. And incidentally, about the who, the when, and the where. So, so in effect, this is part of the reason why I have been focused so deeply on the concepts that I've been focused on. And again, if it wasn't for Daniel, none of this would have come to light at all. For probably 100 years. But I've since learned in the research that that was, that book was written in the 90s.
Right. So I didn't know.
Huh. Yeah. It's been around a while. All of these things that I've been developing have been around a while. And it's only, again, these are seeds. They were conceived of as, because again, I just, it seemed to me that this world wouldn't be ready for this for a long, long time. And I didn't expect to have anybody notice. But now that it has come out, I'm finding that I have to protect the seed. I have to protect the sapling that is now grown much, much sooner than I expected it to. And hopefully it will come to light that it is actually possible for a species to make wise choices and to be a true citizen of the universe.
Well, on that's such a beautiful thought. It feels like, and that was such a powerful moment when you allowed me into the vulnerability of your passion for this, which is something I deeply respect.
Thank you.
When somebody can do that, and that it exists at all, and then even more so when it's shown. This feels like the perfect place to sort of draw this experience that we've been having together to some sort of conclusion. Obviously, Forrest, if send me if for people that want to find out more about your work, I'll stick a link with this.
I'm mostly publishing on mflb.com and uvsm.com. 4 letters.
Send me the links that people can use. Send me a little bit about yourself that I can put people that we haven't discussed today, and
I've had other people write about themselves in ways that would be, it probably, yeah. I'll see if I can put something together that is,
or from a website or something. I know what it's like.
It would feel redundant to me.
We don't need to put. We really don't need to put any of that. Really, to be honest with you, it always makes me laugh. It's always kind of that stuff that publishers put on the back of books, which always makes you cringe, really. Yeah. Because what's been so lovely, and this is what I want to say, what's been so lovely about the experience of being with you, is being with you, and I think it's that which that I see in how you're approaching this that I do really relate to, because I'm always struggling as much as possible. And I think you picked up on it right from the start. to
I
just find that
definitely,
authenticity to connect.
I'm definitely glad to see some of this be celebrated. There was a lot of celebration of the clarity and the insights in the Daniel video, and I'm hoping that some of that expands, that it encourages in inappropriate ways.
And send me an address, and I'll send you a book with pleasure. That would be delightful.
Okay.
And it's great to be connected. And thank you for making the time to take me through as much as I could in one session, what you've been exploring. And I'm so pleased you have. So good for you. How wonderful.
All right. Well, many blessings, and
to you, my friend.
Chat again.
Yeah. God bless you. All right.
Okay.